In the Middle Ages, there was a great kingdom surrounded by high walls in the middle of misty valleys. In the mornings, the mist covering the valley rose up to the castle towers, and to those looking from afar, it seemed not like a castle reaching up to the sky, but like a secret hidden among the clouds. This kingdom was known for its power, but it was feared even more. For ruling over these lands was a very famous and powerful king whose name was on everyone's lips and whose victories were written into legends. This king's name was Armand. Armand was a fearless ruler who had fought in countless battles in his youth and returned victorious from all of them. Enemy kingdoms acted cautiously when they heard his name, while his soldiers were proud of him because he was a leader who had endeared himself to his own army with the discipline and determination he instilled in them. He had a stern gaze and did not speak much, but every word he uttered was an order and commanded attention. He ruled his kingdom with an iron will. His people found him powerful, and his army remained loyal to him. But there was something no one knew. Armand's greatest weakness was his daughter, Seilna. Seilna was the country's only princess. Her beauty was talked about by everyone. She had long hair, a calm face, and deep eyes. But what really set her apart was the slight, lingering sadness on her face. She would often get lost in thought while looking out the high windows of the palace. She felt that her life was not her own choice and felt a void inside. She had lost her mother to illness at a young age. She had grown up within the cold stone walls of the palace, living in the shadow of servants and guards. Everything she wanted was done for her, but she also knew that freedom was something else. She could have been a princess, but her destiny was being written by others, namely her father Armand. After the king, the most powerful person in the palace was the Vizier, Malrick. He had been at the king's side for many years. He was intelligent, measured, and from the outside appeared extremely loyal, and also a successful statesman, measured in his words and respectful in his behavior. Everyone trusted him, but beneath that trust lay another truth. Malrick loved not the cruel king, but the throne. He was patient. He did not rush, but waited for the right moment. He knew that the path to the throne passed through Seilna. If he married her, he would become part of the dynasty, and one day he would be able to take complete control. Over time, he refined his plan. Once he had completely won the king's trust, he began to put his plan into action. One day, he gathered his courage and went before the king. He said he wanted to marry Seilna. He explained that it was necessary for the future of the kingdom and would also increase the power of the dynasty. King Armand thought for a while. His mind was confused. He must not forget that he had to evaluate this marriage not as a father, but as a ruler. But he still accepted this decision. Seilna had no knowledge of this decision. The next day, the decision was announced in the throne room. The hall was as magnificent as ever, but Seilna had no idea what was happening. Her heart froze. The king faced his daughter Seilna and his vizier Malrick and announced his decision. He told his daughter she would marry Vizier Malrick. These words rang in her ears. She was shocked, saddened, her eyes filled with tears, and her heart tightened. She begged, said she didn't want to, unable to hold back her tears. But the king was determined. To him, this was not a personal matter, but a matter of state, and he did not change his mind. When Seilna shut herself in her room, this time she truly felt helpless. The stone walls of the palace closed in on her, her chest tightened, and her head was full. Nothing was the same anymore. The thought that the rest of her life would be spent with a man she did not want made her breath shallow. Just then, a new person arrived at the palace, a young man summoned from a distant village by the king's order. Albert. The king had wanted a jester to lighten the heavy atmosphere in the palace. The palace had been experiencing tense days lately. He thought this would be appropriate so that the palace could have days filled with a little joy. Albert was simply dressed, but his posture was confident. There was intelligence in his eyes. He made people laugh, but not with simple jokes, but with subtle words. Even the king sometimes smiled. Albert was a man of many talents. There was intelligence in his eyes. He made people laugh, but not with simple jokes, but with subtle words. Even the king would smile from time to time. Here we come to the moment when their fates crossed. One day, while Albert was walking through the long corridors of the palace, he ran into Seilna. He noticed that the vizier would eat before the king ate. It left anger instead of fear inside him. Seilna was horrified when she heard this plan, and it was very dangerous. But there was no other way. If she was going to save her father, she had to take the risk. She didn't know what to do. Her father trusted the vizier and wouldn't believe Seilna's words. But after thinking for a while, she gathered her courage and went to her father in the early hours of the morning. Taking a deep breath, she told King Armand what had happened. At first, King Armand didn't believe his daughter as he listened. Because Vizier Malrick had been at the king's side for many years, the thought of such a betrayal was terrifying, and he didn't want to believe it. However, the fear and determination in Seilna's eyes had planted a seed of doubt in the king's mind. The king thought for a long time, and after a silence, announced his decision. He said that if this was indeed true, he wanted it to be revealed in front of everyone. The king had accepted the plan. Seilna had gone to her room. The sun had risen, and breakfast would be served. The king summoned everyone in the palace to the throne room. Albert was there, watching what was happening among the crowd. The king, his daughter Seilna, and the vizier Malrick were at the same table. Malrick tried to appear calm as usual, but his inner anxiety was evident on his face. When the meal arrived, the king did not pick up his spoon. He fixed his eyes on the vizier. "Before I eat this meal, I want my vizier Malrick to taste it," he said. A fatigue on the princess's face, but he believed in himself. He was certain the vizier wouldn't do it, but he would carry out his decision. At the same time, his weak point, his daughter, was also part of this decision. The vizier hesitated for a moment and tried to refuse, but the king's voice commanded. His trembling hands took the spoon and dipped it into the food. Malrick, who had taken a single bite, suddenly grimaced. He tried to stand up but failed. He fell to his knees and collapsed to the floor. The hall fell silent. The poison had already taken effect. The vizier, Malrick's death, right there in front of everyone's eyes, shocked everyone, especially King Armand, who was surprised and saddened by this turn of events. The betrayal weighed heavily on him. The body lying on the floor was the man he had trusted for years. His eyes suddenly found his daughter, and as he hugged her and apologized, his gaze was still on Malrick, who was lying on the floor. Seilna spoke with a trembling voice. "If it weren't for Albert, you would have married me to this cruel vizier. If it weren't for Albert, we would never have known about this betrayal," she said. King Armand also realized that the vizier's goal was not just marriage. At that moment, the king's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked so old, and everyone's eyes were on Albert. Emerging from the crowd, Albert bowed before the king and greeted him. Albert, the young man they once laughed at for his jokes, had now saved the kingdom's reputation and power. The king stood up and thanked Albert, saying he had saved his life, his kingdom, and also the life of his daughter, Seilna. Then, in front of everyone, he announced his decision. Albert would no longer be a jester, but the new vizier, taking the place of the deceased vizier. The decision was accepted. Seilna was very pleased with this situation. For the first time, he felt carefree and secure. Perhaps he felt free for the first time. This news quickly spread everywhere. Everyone's view of Albert changed. He used to make people laugh with his jokes, but now he had performed an unforgettable act of heroism for the kingdom. Everyone now respected Albert, and the king summoned Albert to his presence and said he approved of his marriage to the king's daughter, Seilna. This made both Seilna and Alberta very happy. The wedding day arrived the following week. The public squares were filled with people. Seilna and Alberta walked hand in hand. This marriage was not one made for gain. It was a reward for courage and righteousness. King Armand watched them from afar. He felt regret, but also peace. He knew he hadn't entrusted his daughter's fate to the wrong man. Everyone was happy and secure. Seilna was enjoying the freedom she desired. The story then opened up to a period of change in the kingdom that appeared calm on the surface, but was just as different and profound. Although everything seemed to have settled down in the palace after Malrick's death, something invisible had actually happened. Armand realized for the first time that his power could be shaken. The betrayal of a man he trusted had changed him not only as a ruler, but also as a father. She was no longer as sharp and decisive as before when making decisions. She thought more, listened more, and especially valued her daughter's opinions. Seilna, meanwhile, gazed out the palace windows after her marriage, no longer with sadness, but with hope and peace. The emptiness she had carried within her for so long had been replaced by a sense of meaning. Freedom was not just about escaping the palace, but about being able to speak her mind and have her decisions respected. The feeling of emptiness she had carried inside for so long had been replaced by a sense of meaning. She understood that freedom was not just about escaping the palace, but about being able to speak her mind and having her decisions respected. She was no longer just a princess, but someone whose name was spoken with love among the people. After Albert became vizier, he displayed a very different style of governance than expected. He did not lose his jester past. On the contrary, he said he knew what people laughed at, what they feared, and what they needed. He stated that he was careful, measured, and patient in matters of state, and that everything had its time. He said he did not rush his decisions. Although the court initially struggled to take him seriously, they soon recognized the depth of his intelligence and began to adjust. However, while peace reigned within the kingdom's borders, rumors and whispers began to circulate beyond them. Malrick's death was interpreted in the outer kingdoms as a sign of weakness and ruthlessness. It was said that Armand was aging and the new vizier lacked experience. It was also heard that the neighboring kingdom to the north was strengthening its border forces. Albert had reported these news to the king. He also stated that he thought the danger could grow from within rather than from outside. He said he suspected that King Malrick did not act alone within the palace and was not capable of doing so. He said that he might have secret ties to some outer palaces and lands. He said that this possibility should be investigated and taken into account. When Armand heard this possibility, he felt himself harden again and felt he needed to be vigilant. He stated that he thought the traces of betrayal were still lingering within the walls and that he had begun to suspect the other people in the palace. Although Armand tried to return to his old harshness with his suspicion in the palace, he could no longer deny the change within him. The traces of betrayal had not been erased. As he walked through the palace, his gaze was more careful, his steps more measured. He had ruled for years with his own authority. The traces of betrayal had not been erased. As he walked through the palace, his gaze was more attentive, his steps more measured. For the first time, hesitation had grown within a king who had ruled with his own authority for years. He understood the importance of trust and how fragile it was. This change caught Princess Seilna's attention the most. She sensed that her father now saw her not only as a child, but as a wise ruler. This was a real turning point for her. However, just when it seemed that peace had returned to the palace, news from the border showed that this peace was not very lasting. The northern kingdom's troops were becoming more active. Information had reached the palace that new sieges were being prepared with shifting frontiers, and that some small castles were being monitored. This was not an open declaration of war, but it was essentially an open challenge. Albert thought about these developments calmly and stated his assessment. He said he believed the enemy was testing the kingdom's patience rather than attacking directly. If there was still information or matters loyal to Malrick within, this external pressure and agitation could cause them to act again. When Armand heard this possibility, he felt his old warrior identity reawakening within him. However, he said that this time he chose to wait instead of immediately taking up his sword. He accepted that an impatient and hasty move could be exactly what the enemy wanted. Seilna stated that during this process, he believed the palace was not only a political center, but also a point of trust for the people. He did not neglect to go out into the squares and meet with soldiers' families. His calmness and thoughts were suppressing the people's fear. People were beginning to see that in this situation, the kingdom stood not only with power and a single army, but with unity. Albert and Seilna's relationship also gained a different depth during this tense period. Now, the bond between them was not just an emotional closeness or love, but also a struggle fought shoulder to shoulder. While Albert spent long hours at night poring over maps and making plans, Seilna sat quietly beside him, occasionally offering ideas, sometimes saying nothing at all, but simply supporting him with her presence, knowing that this made him feel safe. Albert noted that when he was with Seilna, his decisions became clearer and his confidence grew. Seilna said she saw his resistance to being crushed under the weight of responsibility. Love was no longer an exciting beginning, but had become a conscious solidarity and unity. But the expected had happened. One night, a sudden and unexpected attack was launched on one of their border castles. It was a small attack, but it did not fail to send a clear message. The northern kingdom would no longer remain in the shadows. This news, which reached the palace, tested Armand's patience and resilience. He began preparations for war. Albert stated that instead of going directly to the front, he proposed strengthening the defense and development line and defeating the enemy in this way. He said he had devised a long-term plan and that the goal should be lasting superiority, not a quick victory. Armand initially said he found this cautious approach too slow, but soon accepted that it was wise. During this process, Seilna became a balancing factor and a source of morale between her father and Albert. She was in a position to soften Armand's harshness and courageously compliment Albert's character and behavior. She realized that, for the first time, they truly looked like a king and queen. However, at this very moment, an unexpected development occurred within the palace. A discrepancy of unknown origin was discovered in the treasury records. A small but steady stream of money was almost disappearing. This suggested a secret connection that could date back to Malrick's time. Albert pointed out that this was no coincidence. The timing of the external pressure and the internal unrest was striking, and he had not overlooked this situation. The palace guards quietly began an investigation. It emerged that some clerks and 2 lower-level nobles frequently sent messengers to areas near the northern border. This situation showed that Malrick's death had not ended everything, and that something was truly afoot. When Armand received this news, his expression hardened once more. The roots of the betrayal might extend deeper than he had thought. However, he stated that this time he would act with a plan, not with anger. Albert argued that it was necessary to move slowly and methodically without fully exposing the internal network, thus avoiding a major response from the outside. He stated that it would be risky to engage in open warfare as long as the enemy kept their hopes alive internally and trusted them. Seilna, meanwhile, thought that as unrest grew within the palace, the people were beginning to sense it, and she knew that the spread of fear would be good for the enemy. So she continued to be more visible and to support the people. In the eyes of the people, she had become a symbol of the queen. As the nights grew longer, the whispers and rumors in the palace increased. No one spoke openly, but everyone sensed that something was approaching. The misty valleys continued to envelop the castle in the mornings, but this time the fog seemed heavier. One evening, Albert came across an old sealed document in the archives. This document had been sent just a few days before Malrick's death and bore a symbol representing the northern kingdom. The document was incomplete. One page had been torn out. This suggested that the plan was not yet complete. Albert first evaluated this information internally. He thought that revealing everything immediately could cause panic in the palace. However, he did not want to hide the truth from Seilna. He told her that the approaching danger was not only coming from the border. When Seilna saw the document, the peace within her vanished again, and her anxiety began to rise once more. But this time, she realized that the anxiety did not frighten her. On the contrary, she felt more determined and stronger. She now knew that she would not leave her fate and decision to the plans of others. When Seilna and Albert explained the situation to Armand, the king remained silent for a long time. He had accepted that he was facing a struggle more complex than any of the wars he had won over the years. But this war would not be fought in open fields, but in shadows and silence. And so his kingdom began to move toward a two-front struggle. Outside, the northern army was preparing, while inside, an invisible web waited patiently. Seilna and Albert were no longer just a couple. They stood like two leaders at the very center of the approaching storm. When the fog once again blanketed the valley, the palace towers were invisible. But this time, no one knew exactly what lay hidden behind that fog, and there was a slight unease. And in the days to come, it seemed the kingdom's fate would be tested once more. As expected, the missing, unsealed document found in the palace became the catalyst for developments that would once again determine the kingdom's destiny. Albert stated that he thought the torn page of the document had been specifically removed. He indicated that it might not be a simple correspondence, but a document carrying the core of the plan. If that page could not be found, the enemy's true purpose would remain unknown and could never be discovered. Armand said that in this situation, action should be taken rather than waiting. He stated that he thought it would be difficult to know about an attack from outside until the secret network and information inside were completely uncovered. Therefore, a quiet but careful investigation was launched within the palace. As the days passed, it was noticed that some guards and soldiers were deliberately shifting their shifts during the changing of the guard. When a guard working in the treasury was questioned, he gave contradictory answers. As the days passed, it was noticed that some guards and soldiers were deliberately shifting during their guard change times. When a guard working in the treasury was questioned, he gave contradictory and suspicious statements. And in the end, it turned out that there was secret communication with the Northern Kingdom. This communication had not ceased after Malrick's death. It was still ongoing, only now more cautious to avoid arousing suspicion. Communication had resumed, albeit with greater care. Albert stated that he thought this was to be expected. He said that such great betrayals were not possible with just one name and were not limited to it, but were based on relationships formed for the sake of profit. However, the fact that this network had not yet reached the center of the palace was a stroke of luck for the kingdom. Right in the middle of this process, an official envoy arrived from the Northern Kingdom. This envoy announced that he had come to request peace talks with the kingdom. But this offer did not seem sincere to Albert. He thought the enemy wanted to buy time. He said that calling for peace while military activity continued at the border was absurd and contradictory. Armand nevertheless agreed to the talks, but this time he was not alone. Seilna and Albert were with him. The kingdom was now being ruled not by a single will, but by three different perspectives. On the day of the talks, the throne room was silent. The envoy's words were soft and simple, but there was no lack of threat in their content. He conveyed that the Northern Kingdom proposed redrawing the borders and placing some castles under joint control. This clearly meant interference in the kingdom's sovereignty and a merger of forces. Albert stated that this was unacceptable. Seilna, however, assessed that the proposal might reflect not weakness, but desperation. He thought that if the Northern Kingdom were truly powerful, it would not have negotiated and would not have come this way. At this point, the decision was made. The peace talks would be extended, but at the same time, the armies would be reinforced. The kingdom's defenses would be completed without the enemy realizing they were being stalled. After months of preparation, a major attack, expected but thought to be small, took place. The northern army pressed against the border gates with all its might. This time, it was not small raids, but an open war. Despite his age, Armand took his place at the head of the army as usual. But the burden of war was now too much for his shoulders. After the first major clash, it was decided that he should be sent back to the palace, and Albert took over the entire burden and defense. Albert's defense and fighting were based on patience. He drew the enemy into narrow passages, cutting off their paths. However, the night raids had demoralized them. After weeks of struggle, the northern army was forced to retreat, and of course, victory was achieved. But after this victory, Armand's health rapidly deteriorated. The burden of war and years of fatigue had consumed his body. One evening, he summoned Seilna and told her that he believed the kingdom was now her time. He said that he had finally understood that power comes not only from harshness and strength, but also from vitality and thoughtfulness. And sadly, shortly thereafter, Armand passed away. The kingdom was plunged into deep mourning. Seilna was no longer just a princess. She was also the sole owner of the throne. The coronation ceremony had taken place. It was magnificent, but Seilna's heart was silent. Her father's death had worn her down, and the legacy was heavy, but not frightening. Albert remained constantly by her side. However, he chose to stay in the background. He believed the queen's power should not be overshadowed by his own, and he wanted her to see her own strength. When Seilna ascended the throne, her first decision was to secure the borders with a permanent peace treaty. The northern kingdom was now worn down, and in this situation, the powerful party on the throne and in the kingdom was Seilna. Superiority and will that could not be achieved through war were achieved through reason. Over the years, the kingdom changed. All systems were reorganized, people's assemblies and tents were established, and military training became modern. The kingdom was no longer feared and dreaded, but had become a respected and valued power. Seilna and Albert's marriage also matured and gained loyalty during this process. What began as sudden, rapidly growing love and excitement gradually transformed into deep trust. They learned to lean on each other in difficult times, to be happy together in good times, and support each other in bad times, to complement each other in moments of decision, and to support each other by coming up with new ideas. While this was happening, the misty valleys still enveloped the castle in the mornings. But now that mist no longer brought fear or tension, it reminded them of the past. One evening, Seilna climbed years ago. He remembered feeling helpless and alone in the same place. Now, he was different, strong, married to the one he loved. Even though he had lost his father, he had learned to be strong. His destiny was not written by others. Albert came to his side. The two looked out over the valley hand in hand. After a long struggle, they found peace in each other's company, contemplating the silence of the peace that had come. As the days passed, their kingdom had endured long wars, seen betrayal, tasted death, but learned to stand tall without being destroyed. And now, the power was no longer found solely in the sharpness of a single sword, but also in the balance of mind, patience, and unity. As the years passed, the stone walls of the palace began to fill with new, lively sounds. Queen Seilna and her husband Albert had 2 children. The elder was named Arian, the younger Leora. Arian inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's fortitude. He was a quiet observer, thinking before he spoke, acting with his mind, spending hours poring over maps, constantly making plans. Leora, on the other hand, had inherited the courage of her grandfather Armand and also the deep compassion and mercy in her mother's heart. She mingled with the people, talked to the soldiers, chatted with the people, played with the children, but when necessary, she maintained her authority, her determination and sharpness in her eyes, silencing everyone. The palace was no longer just a center of government, but a place where a new era was emerging and a center of trust for the people. To the highest tower of the palace, this new era was growing not in the shadow of fear, but in the light of conscious remembrance and resistance. The stones of the palace had not forgotten the past, but those memories were no longer a threat. They seemed to be a guide to a new path. Every morning, as Seilna passed through the throne room, she remembered her father, who had once stood in the same place, and thought about the difficult decisions that had been made. But she wore pride on her face, not regret, because the kingdom had now learned not only to survive, but to grow, to be reborn, to renew itself. Seilna never raised her children in fear. She always reminded them of her past and set an example for them. She also told them stories of war, but taught them the importance of paying the price, not of victory. She told them not of the clash of swords or the drawing of swords, but of the silence that echoed in the palace after the clash and the withdrawal. Alba showed them how betrayal grows silently, how power can be weakened by arrogance. He told them that one must fight not only against enemies, but also against the shadow within oneself. He taught Arian patience, Leora strategy, and patience, but most of all, he taught them that they must trust each other, because they knew that the kingdom's greatest mistake had once been the concentration of power in a single hand. Therefore, in the new era, decisions were discussed within the family. If necessary, everyone would state their opinion and disagreements would arise, but the young people's ideas would also be heard. Long evening tables would be set, maps unfolded, trade routes discussed, and complaints from the people evaluated. While Arian prepared plans to expand trade routes to strengthen the northern borders, Leora developed embassy projects to establish cultural ties with neighboring kingdoms. Though the 2 siblings sometimes disagreed and arguments arose, these conflicts and debates brought unity and progress, not ambition, and that was what they gained from them. Seilna watched their arguments and then their unity, remembered the past, thinking of the days when no one even asked her opinion, when she stood alone looking at the walls. Now, however, the children defended their opinions openly, listened to each other, and found common ground. This was the greatest victory for her, because freedom was not just breaking chains or marching to a single beat, but being able to express one's thoughts without fear. However, when peace lasted too long, people could become complacent and anxious with the fear that came with too much comfort. One day, the missing page of that sealed document, torn out years ago, appeared in the palace archives. Found in a dusty chest, this page revealed that the Northern Kingdom's plan at that time targeted not only the borders, but also the lineage of the dynasty. This information reminded us how deep and calculated the past was. However, the plan remained unfinished. The betrayal had been purged from within. When Arian read the document, his face hardened. He did not take the shadow of the past lightly. Leora, however, with her usual determination and ideas, said that this was the shadow of the past and that it should be met with reason, not fear. To her, knowing the past was important, but not surrendering to it. When Albert looked at his children, he realized that the burden he once carried on his shoulders was now slowly shifting to theirs. Seilna knew deep down that each generation would face its own trials, and the most important part was being able to stand together and strong in the face of that trial. And the most important part was to be able to stand together and strong in the face of that test. Upon this, the family made a joint decision. The future of the kingdom would be protected not only by military power, but also by knowledge and authority. An open academy class was established for young people in the palace, and young representatives and teachers were brought into the people's assemblies. Old records were reorganized, secret correspondence was made transparent, and every plan was made to bring it to light. While Arian reorganized the defense strategies, Leora strengthened diplomatic ties. Trade routes expanded, new ports were built, and envoys and soldiers were sent not only to make agreements, but also to share culture and unity. Together, they established a transparent and strict governance system to prevent the secret networks that once shook the kingdom from forming again. Decisions were recorded, implemented, and made public. This was no longer just a matter of the throne, it was also about preserving a legacy. Years later, Seilna watched her children standing side by side on the palace balcony, speaking proudly before the people. Arian's voice was calm yet powerful, while Leora's gaze was sharp and determined. Their posture radiated not only the energy of youth, but also a wisdom learned from the past and the patience and unity their mother had taught them. In that moment, she understood that the kingdom had not only survived, but had spread its roots everywhere. When Albert took her hand as Seilna watched them, they both thought the same thing. Power and authority had changed, but values and unity remained the same. Now, power was not for intimidating and holding people back, but for keeping them safe and protecting them. It was not for giving orders, but for showing the way. When the fog covered the valley again, the castle towers disappeared among the dark shadows, but this time the fog did not bring fear and anxiety, but reminded them of the lessons learned from the past, of patience, unity, and togetherness. When morning came, the fog would lift, the sun would hit the stone walls, and the kingdom would be illuminated once more. This cycle remained unchanged for years, because now that kingdom was strong not only through wars, but also through the new generation it had raised. It had found its strength not in the sword, but in the mind, not in fear, but in balance. And time once again showed that he, whose destiny had once been attempted to be written by another, now wrote his own destiny and even the future of a kingdom with his pen. But he stood firm without collapsing or fearing. Power was no longer a harsh will, but a balanced unity. And so that castle amidst the mists became a symbol of a kingdom known not for fear and hesitation, but for patience and strength. A princess whose destiny was once attempted to be written by others became the queen of her own kingdom, and she became a mother who guided her children by teaching them lessons from her past, raising them differently than herself. A young man, once known for his jokes, became the kingdom's wisest and most intelligent Vizier, and at the same time, its most loyal husband. And a kingdom won its greatest victory not on the battlefield, but by overcoming the darkness and impatience within itself.